My sister's parenting is a disaster. Her kids' crimes forced me to dial 911. I'd just gotten back from a long shift at the warehouse when I noticed something odd. The door to my backyard shed stood wide open. Normally, I keep it locked up tight, especially because I store plenty of valuable items inside. But now, the padlock was dangling, snapped right through the shackle. A sinking feeling gripped me as I approached. Sure enough, the inside of the shed looked ransacked. Gardening tools strewn about, gas canisters missing, and to my dismay, every bag of empty soda cans I'd been saving was gone. I know it sounds trivial, but I go through a lot of soda. I'd been collecting those cans in hefty trash bags to eventually redeem for recycling cash. Each bag represented days, sometimes weeks, worth of soda, and there were several of them, enough to make a nice side profit. Now they'd vanished, along with a couple of yard tools, a machete I use for brush clearing, and at least one full gas can for my lawnmower. At first, I thought maybe I'd misplaced some items or left the shed improperly locked. But then I saw the jagged remains of the broken padlock, confirming it was no accident. I decided to check the security cameras I had installed around the property a few months ago. I put them up mostly because of petty theft around the neighborhood. Missing mail, packages disappearing off porches. Figured it couldn't hurt. I never expected to actually catch a crime in progress. But there it was on the playback. 3 figures sneaking into my yard, right after sunrise, presumably when I'd already left for work. The footage wasn't perfect, grainy with some sun glare, but I recognized them almost immediately. My 3 nephews. They weren't even being subtle about it. The video showed them using some kind of hammer or heavy tool to smash the padlock off the shed door, rummaging through my stuff and hauling out as many bags of soda cans and tools as they could carry. I stood there, remote in hand, replaying the clip in a state of disbelief. My nephews, David 15, Troy 14, and Caleb 12, had always been a bit wild, but never did I think they'd break into my property. Angry and hurt, I dialed my sister's number. Sarah picked up, her voice polite and unsuspecting. I wasted no time. "You need to talk to your boys. They broke into my shed, stole my stuff. I have it on camera." At first, she sounded confused, maybe even amused by the accusation. Then, as I laid out the details, she got defensive. Her husband, Mike, jumped on the line too. I could practically hear them shaking their heads. "That's impossible," Mike insisted. "They were supposed to be at school this morning." The more I explained, the more they brushed it off like I was overreacting or had the wrong culprits. Finally, I told them I had actual video footage. Instantly, the tone shifted. Sarah grew silent. Mike stopped talking over me. I offered to come by their place and show them the video myself, laptop and all. With no other option, they hesitantly agreed. By then, my anger had simmered down into a kind of hollow disappointment. How could they question me so bluntly, as if their kids were angels and I was just stirring up drama? When I hung up, I watched the security footage one more time, feeling a strange mix of betrayal and sadness. I trusted those boys. Let them hang around my yard. Never suspected they'd violate that trust in such a blatant way. And the worst part? If my sister and Mike hadn't seen the footage, they would have sworn up and down their kids were innocent. I was about to find out just how deep this family conflict would go, and how my nephew's bad choices would affect all of us. Later that evening, I arrived at my sister's house with my laptop in hand, prepared to show Sarah and her husband, Mike, the unmistakable footage of their 3 sons breaking into my shed. Sarah opened the door looking tense but trying to appear calm. Mike was behind her, arms folded, his expression skeptical. Without wasting time, I set my laptop on the kitchen table and played the security camera clip. The video spoke for itself. David, Troy, and Caleb were clearly seen forcing open the shed door, carrying out hefty trash bags and a few of my tools. Sarah's face went pale as her husband's jaw clenched. "So," I said, my voice steady, "still think they're little angels?" Mike shook his head. That's definitely them, he admitted, eyes still glued to the screen. Sarah looked like she might cry. Where did they even get that hammer? They shouldn't even have tools like this, she mumbled, more to herself than to me. With the proof staring her in the face, neither of them could deny it anymore. After an uncomfortable silence, Sarah finally muttered, "I'm sorry. We had no idea. They said they were at school today." "Clearly not," I replied. "They called the boys out of their rooms one by one, grilling them about the stolen cans, the missing gasoline, and my damaged tools. David and Troy tried to deny it at first. Caleb just stood there, staring at the floor. But they finally caved once Sarah said she'd seen the footage for herself. She insisted they return whatever they still had. So Troy ran to the backyard shed where they'd stashed some things, bringing back my garden tools, machete, and a couple of other items. I was thankful to get those back, though the gas can was empty. No telling where its contents went. As for the aluminum cans I'd planned to recycle, they confessed they'd cashed them in that very morning for close to $200. Apparently, they wasted no time spending that money on junk food, soda, and whatever else they felt like buying. I demanded they reimburse me for both the lost cans and the busted padlock, which together came to nearly $200. Sarah shot me a pained look. "We have 3 kids to feed and a mortgage. You know our finances are tight," she said, her tone laced with exasperation. "I'm aware," I answered bluntly, "but that's not my problem. Your boys broke in and stole my stuff. Either you pay me back or I take this to the police." Her jaw dropped. Mike started to protest. "Look, it's not that we don't want to fix this, but we're strapped for cash. You seriously can't cut us some slack here." I crossed my arms. "I've put up with too much already. Missing tools, ruined padlock, and now I'm out $200 that your kids blew on snacks and games. Slack? No way." My ultimatum hung in the air. Sarah and Mike turned their anger toward their sons, berating them for their reckless behavior. But once their scolding died down, that anger quickly pivoted back to me, as if I was the real villain for demanding they make things right. "I can't believe you're doing this to family," Sarah said bitterly. "I'm not the one who robbed family," I shot back. "And I'm giving you 2 days to pay me back. Otherwise, I'm involving the police." Their stony silence told me all I needed to know. They despised that I was willing to press charges, but they'd also seen the video. They had no leverage to negotiate. As I left, Sarah followed me to the door, voice low. "We'll talk about this, but you know how hard things are for us right now. You could at least show some compassion." I didn't bother responding. Compassion is a two-way street, and it wasn't me who kicked in a locked door and stole from my own relatives. If I was heartless, I thought, it was only because they'd forced me to be. 2 days went by, and I still hadn't heard a peep from Sarah or Mike about the money they owed me. My ultimatum was simple: pay the nearly $200 for my stolen soda cans and the busted padlock, or I'd file a police report. Yet all I received were a few snippy texts from my sister, accusing me of being heartless and cold for demanding cash they didn't have. On the morning of the 3rd day, I decided enough was enough. I got in my car and drove down to the local police station. I handed over my thumb drive with the surveillance footage, clear as day, showing my nephews forcing open the shed door, hauling out my cans, and rifling through my tools. The officer I spoke with seemed both surprised and relieved to have such solid evidence. Most theft complaints in the neighborhood were based on suspicion alone, but here I had timestamps, faces, and even receipts of the damage they caused. While I was at the station, my phone buzzed with a new message. It was a group text from my 3 nephews, presumably typed by the oldest one, David. The first line was a string of insults. The second was a blurry photo of what looked like someone's middle finger in front of a soda can. "Screw you, we didn't even take that much," the message read. My stomach churned with a sick mix of anger and disappointment. They'd already admitted their theft, Yet here they were mocking me. I showed the officer the text, and he encouraged me to screenshot it for evidence. "This only strengthens your case," he said, shaking his head. "It shows they're unrepentant." After I finished filing the report, I went home feeling oddly lighter. I'd been torn about calling the police on family, but their brazen disrespect made me realize I had nothing to feel guilty about. The fallout within my extended family was surprisingly in my favor. My mother, who lives a few states away, called me that evening. Initially, I feared she'd side with my sister out of sympathy for the kids. But it turned out she herself had lost a few valuable items when these nephews visited over the summer. My mom hadn't wanted to accuse them outright, but now it all made sense. Similarly, my grandparents, who once tried to remain neutral in any family spat, said they'd grown tired of hearing about Sarah's kids borrowing things without permission. My aunt and uncle, on my dad's side, also recalled missing items after one of the boys stayed with them for a weekend. Suddenly, I was receiving texts and voicemails from relatives I rarely spoke to, all offering their support or venting their own frustrations. They'd wondered who had been pilfering small tools, loose change, and random knickknacks. Some had shrugged it off, blaming forgetfulness or misplaced items, but now the puzzle fit. These kids had a pattern of stealing from family. Sarah and Mike, however, were far from accepting responsibility. They lashed out, condemning me for involving outsiders, the police, in a family matter. When word spread that the police were officially investigating the break-in, Sarah's tone turned even nastier. She accused me of ruining her boys' futures and making things worse by escalating a private dispute into a criminal case. Yet none of that changed the facts. Her kids had committed theft, broke my property, and even taunted me about it. I was done worrying about whether I was being too harsh. Over the years, these nephews had been swiping small items here and there, leaving everyone suspicious but lacking proof. Now I had actual video, and if being a bad guy meant I was finally putting an end to their petty crime spree, so be it. The rest of the family seemed to agree. Many had their own grievances with the trio's sticky fingers. It wasn't just about my soda cans or my lock anymore. It was about enforcing boundaries we should have set long ago. At a few days after I filed my police report, I woke up to a barrage of texts from family members. Several of them had heard that my nephews, David, Troy, and Caleb, were taken into custody early that morning. The police, armed with the surveillance footage and the multiple complaints coming from different relatives in our extended family, had enough evidence to make an arrest. It was surreal to think that my teenage nephews had gone from stealing soda cans to spending a night or more in a juvenile holding cell. Sarah and Mike, of course, were livid. According to my cousin Marcia, they rushed down to the station, insisting there must be a misunderstanding. They apparently tried to pin the blame on me yet again, arguing that I was blowing things out of proportion. But the cops were unimpressed. Not only did they have my camera footage, they also had statements from multiple family members who had reported small thefts for months. Later that afternoon, Sarah and Mike showed up at my house. I had just gotten off work and was about to head inside when I saw them marching up the driveway, looking furious. Sarah's voice was already trembling with outrage. "How could you do this?" she shouted. "They're just kids. You called the police on your own nephews." I kept the door half shut, my heart pounding, but I forced myself to stay calm. "They're the ones who broke into my shed. They stole from me." Mike's face reddened. "You could have handled this like a family matter. Now they have a criminal record because of you." I took a slow breath, reminding myself not to get sucked into a shouting match. "No, they have a criminal record because they committed a crime," I said plainly. "I offered you a chance to pay for the damages. You didn't. I warned you what would happen." They started yelling about how I was ruining their boys' futures, and that I should have just let it go. The indignation in their voices made it sound like they believed I was punishing the kids out of spite, rather than reacting to a genuine burglary. By then, I'd had enough. I told them in no uncertain terms that if they didn't leave my property immediately, I would call the police again, this time for trespassing and harassment. Mike looked ready to argue more, but Sarah tugged on his arm. They muttered something about me being heartless and stormed off. Standing there on my porch, I found myself shaking with a mix of anger and adrenaline. Part of me felt guilty. No one loves the idea of calling the cops on family. But another part of me knew it was the right decision. They had left me no choice. That evening, I decided to take it a step further. I would file a small claims suit against Sarah and Mike to recoup the cost of the broken padlock and the stolen cans. Combined, it was only a couple $100, but it was the principle that mattered. They had shown zero willingness to reimburse me. Maybe a court date would finally force them to acknowledge responsibility. When word got around about my plan, a few relatives were horrified at first. "Why can't you just handle this privately?" Aunt Linda asked me over the phone. I explained my side, how I tried everything short of legal action, how Sarah and Mike had repeatedly dismissed me. Surprisingly, most of the family stood by me, especially once they learned how long the nephews had been filching small items from different relatives. My grandma called me to say she was proud I was taking a stand, that nobody should tolerate theft, family or not. It felt odd to have so many of them rally behind me now, when they had done so little for so long, but at least it confirmed that Sarah and Mike's outrage wasn't swaying the entire family. In fact, it seemed to be pushing them further from everyone else. They could glower and protest all they wanted. This time, I had the upper hand, and their kids were facing actual consequences for their actions. The next step in this unfolding drama was taking Sarah and Mike to small claims court. After the boys' arrest, I decided I'd had enough of their excuses and reluctance to pay me back. So, with the help of a friend who had some legal know-how, I filed a suit asking for $500. That amount would cover a few things: the replacement of my damaged shed lock, compensation for the soda cans they'd stolen, plus the small court filing fee, and a little extra for the headache they caused, though I labeled it as moral damages. Once news of the lawsuit filtered through the family grapevine, the reactions were mixed. A few of my aunts wrung their hands, saying, "Isn't this taking it too far?" But I stood firm. My sister and her husband had ignored every peaceful route, refused to give me a penny, and then screamed at me when I had them cornered with evidence. So as far as I was concerned, they could either step up now or face a judge. Sarah and Mike tried to argue that they didn't owe me anything beyond what they'd already returned. My tools minus the empty gas can. But I pointed out I still had a broken lock to replace and about $200 worth of aluminum cans that had vanished forever. Add on the court costs and $500 felt like a fair total. If they'd given me that money in the beginning, we'd never have gotten this far. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, I kept receiving accusatory texts, mostly along the lines of "You're punishing us more than necessary," or "Do you know how hard it is to raise 3 kids on a single income?" Whenever they complained about their finances, I reminded them that it wasn't my job to fund their children's petty theft. They'd had every chance to settle informally, and they'd blown it off. Finally, about a week before the court date, my sister called me in an uncharacteristically calm voice. She said they wanted to meet in person, at my place, to work this out. I braced myself for more shouting but agreed, figuring it was worth hearing them out. They arrived one evening with an envelope in hand. Mike looked exhausted, and Sarah seemed drained, like they'd spent hours discussing what to do. Without much small talk, Mike simply said, "We can't afford a drawn-out legal fight. We're prepared to give you $500 in cash if you drop the suit." He handed over the envelope, stuffed with $20 and $50 bills. Sarah, meanwhile, tried to salvage her pride. "We still think you're going overboard, but we're done fighting. Our kids already got arrested. We don't want things to escalate further." I took the envelope, counted it quickly, and tucked it away. "This is what you owed me from the start," I replied. "You realize if you'd just done the right thing earlier, we wouldn't be here now." They both nodded, looking more embarrassed than I'd ever seen them. Sarah cleared her throat. "We know. Believe me, we know," she said quietly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, could you at least talk to the judge or the prosecutor and help the kids get a lighter sentence? They're still minors. This is a big lesson for them, and for us, too." I thought about it. I wasn't out for blood. I'd simply wanted justice. I can't promise anything, but I'm not against telling the authorities I've been compensated, I said evenly. "What happens next depends on the system, but I'll state the truth, that you did pay me back and that I'd be okay with a plea deal involving community service or something along those lines." They both let out a sigh, murmuring thank yous. After that, they left without further drama. For me, the relief was immediate. Sure, $500 wouldn't erase the betrayal or the anger, but it paid for my repairs and replaced the soda can money. More importantly, it forced them to acknowledge, if only for a moment, that what their kids did was serious, and that they couldn't bully or guilt me into letting it slide. With that envelope in my pocket, I closed the door behind them, feeling like a small but significant corner had been turned in this whole messy ordeal. The bigger question, how the legal system would handle 3 teenage burglars, remained, but at least I'd claimed a measure of restitution. For once, my sister and Mike had to face the consequences of ignoring their son's bad behavior, rather than expecting me to forgive and forget. Things settled down for a short while after my sister and her husband finally paid the $500. The younger 2 nephews even began showing signs of genuine regret. They'd apologize if they spotted me at a family function, or check in to see if there was anything I needed help with. I took their apologies cautiously, but I appreciated that they were at least making an effort. Their older brother, however, had a very different reaction. David, the oldest, seemed to be seething with anger. I'd hear through the family grapevine how he blamed me for ruining his life, as though my calling the police was the real crime, not his theft. Even after his court appearance, which resulted in him getting a stern lecture from the judge and some mandated community service, he acted like a victim who needed revenge. That revenge came one night around midnight. I was half asleep when I heard a strange rattling noise at my back door. At first, I figured it was just the wind or maybe a stray cat. But then came the unmistakable sound of breaking glass. Heart pounding. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to the window overlooking the backyard. To my shock, I saw David wielding not one, but 2 hammers, one in each hand. He was smashing at my newly replaced lock on the shed door, and when my motion light flicked on, he hurled one of the hammers toward my living room window, shattering it into hundreds of shards. Caught off guard and terrified, I dialed 911. While I waited for the police, I shouted that they were on their way. David looked up, and even from a distance, I could see raw fury on his face, mixed with something else, maybe desperation. He tried the back door, pounding on it hard enough that I worried it would give way. Fortunately, sirens blared in the distance sooner than he anticipated. He dropped the remaining hammer and took off. The police arrived minutes later, and I showed them the camera footage once again. It was grainy in the dark, but unmistakably him. Plus, I'd recognized his silhouette, his gait, even the sweatshirt he liked to wear. The officers took my statement, and by morning, David had been found and arrested a second time. This time, the judge was far less lenient. A court-appointed psychiatrist evaluated him, and the tentative diagnosis was bipolar disorder. While it explained some of his erratic, impulsive behavior, it didn't excuse it. The court mandated therapy, medication, and additional community service, all under probation. And that's how my teenage nephew ended up in a mental health treatment program, attending mandatory counseling sessions instead of hanging out with friends after school. In the midst of all this, the 2 younger nephews flat out condemned their brother's antics. They told me they were tired of his anger issues and drama, and they'd rather try to rebuild trust. They visited me a few times, apologizing again and again for their part in the barn theft. I'm cautious, but I allow them small chances to prove themselves, like helping me move some yard equipment or work on a minor home project. So far, they've stuck to their word and shown up each time, ready to pitch in without complaint. Meanwhile, the rest of the family has distanced themselves from Sarah and her husband, citing how they let their children spiral out of control. Mom and Dad, our parents, told me they were exhausted from covering up for Sarah's kids and offering endless bailouts, only to see them escalate into real crimes. Some cousins expressed fear about having the trio over, worried about what else might go missing. Many blamed Sarah and her husband for not reining in David earlier. Maybe if they had taken smaller acts of mischief more seriously, he wouldn't have turned to outright vandalism. Now Sarah and Mike find themselves increasingly isolated. Some relatives still empathize, saying mental health is a complicated issue, which is true. But even they believe Sarah and Mike let things fester for too long. There's a collective sense of relief that the oldest nephew is finally getting psychiatric help. Whether he can mend the relationships he's shattered is another question entirely. As for me, I'm focusing on the nephews who want to do better. The younger two have taken their lumps and seem willing to change. I'm not rolling out the red carpet for them, but I'm letting them earn back trust bit by bit. David, on the other hand, remains on the outside, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Only time will tell if he'll accept the help he needs or keep blaming the world for his troubles. And the months that followed, it became painfully clear that my oldest nephew's problems weren't behind him. Even with mandated therapy and medication, he struggled with anger, impulsiveness, and a persistent belief that everyone was out to get him. This surfaced most visibly in an incident at his high school. Another fight, this time allegedly provoked by a classmate's harmless remark. He lashed out with the same bottled-up rage he'd shown when he tried to break into my place with hammers. Although his younger brothers seemed eager to move on and make amends, my oldest nephew stayed on a path of defiance. Sarah and Mike, drained by the constant pressure from neighbors, law enforcement, and the extended family, considered uprooting everyone and moving to another county entirely, anywhere they could get a fresh start without the sideways glances and whispered rumors. I heard through one of my cousins that they'd even contacted a real estate agent to scope out listings, though it wasn't clear if they could afford to relocate given their financial situation. Meanwhile, my relationship with the younger nephews took a surprising turn for the better. After months of apologies and consistent effort, they managed to earn back some of my trust. They dropped by occasionally to help with yard work or just watch a ball game with me. One Sunday afternoon, Troy and Caleb sat on my back porch, sipping soda with my permission this time, and talking about their plans for next summer. If everything went smoothly with their probation, they wanted to get part-time jobs. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in ages, and it reminded me that not all was lost. It became an unspoken rule among the family that my oldest nephew was not welcome at my house, nor at most relatives' homes, without a parent present. For a while, Sarah and Mike tried to defend him, but even they had to concede that his behavior had spiraled well beyond normal teen rebellion. It came down to keeping him on a tight leash, driving him to therapy appointments, and ensuring he did his community service hours without incident. Rumor had it he was counting down the days until he turned 18. He told friends he planned to leave the family altogether, possibly disappearing across the state line. Part of me felt a twinge of sadness hearing that. He was my nephew after all, but I couldn't deny the apprehension. If he wasn't ready to address his anger and bipolar disorder, another meltdown could be lurking around the corner. As for me, I tried my best to stay out of the latest drama. I wasn't thrilled about the possibility that Sarah and Mike would move away, but I couldn't blame them for wanting to escape the bad blood. I just hoped they'd realize changing zip codes wouldn't magically fix their son's issues. You can't outrun problems rooted in mental health and dysfunctional parenting. Still, I don't wish my nephew ill. In a perfect world, he'd work through his aggression and find healthier ways to cope. But for now, I keep my distance, reinforcing boundaries I never thought I'd need with family members. I focus on the positives. My younger nephews, who've genuinely changed their ways, and a neighborhood that feels safer since they owned up to their mistakes. Even the extended family, once hesitant, has rallied around the principle that theft and violence won't be tolerated. Though the situation remains fragile, I've come to accept it. Some relationships can be rebuilt, others may have to fade. My oldest nephew has a challenging road ahead, and only time will tell if he figures out how to walk it. Meanwhile, I'm protecting my home and sanity, letting my sister, Mike, and the courts handle the fallout. Life goes on, a little more complicated, but with each passing day, the worst of the story feels a bit further behind me.